And welcome to the Kaplan-Schweizer video series. In this series, of course, we'll be covering level 1, and this is the first clip, so we'll be going through ethics material today, which I'm sure you're excited about. My name's Andrew Holmes. I am a professor at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Teach finance, obviously, and a former full-time employee of Kaplan-Schweizer. Been lucky enough to be part of Kaplan-Schweizer's expert content delivery team for the last 10 years or so. So I've worked with the curriculum for a long time, and I'm hoping that I can help you get past this material and ultimately get this level 1 exam behind you so that you can move on to the really fun stuff in levels 2 and 3. Now, for some of you, this is your very first study effort in the CFA curriculum. So you're a first-time level 1 taker. You got your notes, you got the videos, and you decided to start with the videos, and you're probably very excited about that. Well, let me just start off with a word of caution. So I want you to remember as you go through this that the CFA exams are different. And what I mean by that is you may have set for some blue sky or government licensing exams, those types of things. Maybe you've done one of the accounting exams, a CA or a CPA. Perhaps you have gone through something like a CFP or, a managerial accounting exam, those types of things. Okay, those are in their own right, they have some difficult parts to them, but a large portion of the curriculum associated with many professional designation exams in our industry rely a lot on memorization. Well, there's certainly going to be lots of things that you're going to put on a formula sheet as you go through the CFA curriculum. But the CFA exam is different in that you have to strive for understanding. You can't memorize your way into a CFA charter. So keep that in mind as you're going through. This is, I think, one of the more difficult professional designation exams. I think it's the most difficult in our industry. So make sure that when you are preparing, you're preparing for a question that is going to be something that doesn't look exactly like the example that you are reviewing. So you're going to have to be able to look at the material, you're going to have to be able to adjust in real time, and then apply basic principles in order to answer the exam questions. People that try to memorize their way into these exams at any of the 3 levels are going to end up with problems associated with that. And the typical person that tries to do that at level 1 fails and then either gives up or comes back and tries again and realizes that they're going to have to go in and get the principles. If you're a first-time test taker, my suggestion is that you work to have the principles under your belt, that is to strive for understanding the first time around so that you don't have to go through this again because the process is long and painful. All right. Okay, so what are we doing today? Today we are going to study ethics. Now, when we talk about ethics, what does that mean? Well, that means that we're going through and we're talking about the Code of Ethics and the Standards of Professional Conduct primarily, although we'll see that there's some additional material to that. Now, by a show of hands, let me see how many people are excited about studying ethics. All right, well, I'm hoping that nobody raised their hands. Now, how many of you think that the ethics material will not require as much intellectual effort as, let's say, derivatives or quant methods or fixed income? Okay, so there are some more hands up. Okay, well, what I'm trying to convey to you here is that the ethics material is difficult. So many people look at this material, especially first-time test takers, especially level 1 test takers, and say, look, this is material that describes ethical behavior. I am a good person, okay? I don't beat my kids, I don't do all these other bad things, I don't rob banks, okay? So therefore, I'm going to be able to identify ethical versus unethical material, and I'm going to do well on this big chunk, that is 15% of the exam at level 1, and this is going to be a source of points, excess points for me. Well, I've got news for you, and it's not good news in this case, and that is that this material is hard. Right? So the joke that I like to tell is that if the question you're reading on the exam has to do with someone stealing candy from a baby, okay, well, I can assure you that if that's the setup, that's the narrative of the question, the question will not deal with the act of stealing the candy from the baby. It's going to deal with the custody of the candy after the stealing, or it's going to deal with disclosure to the baby, or it's going to deal with something about how you treated the baby carriage or something along those lines. So the point of all this is that being a good person is not going to help you with this material. So you're going to have to understand, and you're going to have to be able to apply this material. And this is a hard area of the exam. And at level 1, it's 15%. So this is a big chunk of the exam, and this is something that you're going to have to be on top of, and it's going to require significant effort. Now, I teach in years past anyway, have taught a level 1 prep class at BYU for my students there. And what I make them do, and we do this in the winter semester as we're preparing for the June exam, I make them read the ethics material at the beginning of the semester, and I give them a test, and then I make them read it again at the end. I think that's a great system. So start off your study efforts by going through ethics, okay, and then plan on 4 to 5 weeks before the exam. Okay, you'll need that last few weeks to deal with practice exams and those types of things. So this isn't a last week type thing, but when you're getting down into the home stretch, you go over and you review the ethics material again. A good system also is to keep your ethics book on your nightstand, and as you go to bed each night, spend 5 or 10 minutes reading ethics, reviewing the case studies, those types of things, because you're going to have to develop some intuition about how to apply this material on the exam, and it's just not easy, and being a good person is not going to help you. All right? So keep that in mind as background. What are we facing now? Okay, well, essentially what we have in the ethics material in the CFA curriculum is we have a code of ethics and a standard of professional conduct. That is tested at all 3 levels. Okay, so you're going to see we're going to spend close to 2 hours going over the code and standards. I know everyone goes, oh, 2 hours. Anyway, but that's just what it takes. We're going to spend close to 2 hours in the video series going over the code and standards. And that material, you're going to see it here at level 1. It's going to be repeated exactly the same at level 2 and then again at level 3. Now, I do believe the testing gets more difficult as you progress through, but the material is exactly the same. So the material for the main part, the big part of your reading, a lot of your study time that's devoted to ethics is going to be the same across all 3 levels. But then at all 3 levels, there's also what I refer to as the stub material. So you're going to have the code and standards and then stub material. And the stub material here at level 1 has to do with GIPS, or Global Investment Performance Standards. Now, also at level 1, we have a little intro thing that we're going to do that you don't see formally at the other 2 levels, and that is the idea of a professional conduct program, or how do we discipline members of CFAI or CFA charter holders if some potential breach has been brought to light. So we're going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about how we enforce ethics. Then we're going to spend a bunch of time diving into this main body that will be repeated 3 times before you get your charter, that is the code and standards. And then we'll have 20 or 30 minutes at the end to introduce the idea of global investment performance standards. You'll get a much more thorough review of those at level 3. So that's what you've got to look forward to over the next couple of years. But over the next couple of hours, what we've got to do is get through the material for level 1. So if this is your first study effort, welcome to the program. I'm excited for you. I personally am a big fan of the CFA curriculum, so I think that this is something that is good for our profession, and it will be good for you individually. I don't think anyone can get a CFA charter without learning something. So I use what I call the Steve Thorley rule. I have a friend, Steve Thorley, that knows a lot about everything that goes on in investments, and in particular in equity securities. But nonetheless, and when he went through the program, he had to study. So that's what I tell people. If Steve had to study, everybody has to study. All right, so with that as an introduction, let's jump in, talk about our professional conduct review program, and then we'll go into the code and standards. And then finally, a couple of hours from now, we'll get to the GIP stuff. But when we get to the GIP stuff, that'll actually go pretty fast. So put your head down and try to find something to enjoy in all this. And I realize that could be a little difficult. So like I say, no one is particularly excited about studying ethics, but it's something that you have to do, and especially level 1, where it's such a big chunk of the exam. So at levels 2 and 3, it's a little smaller proportionally, although it's still significant enough that you're going to need to spend time at levels 2 and 3 also when you get there. All right, so what about the CFA Institute Professional Conduct Program? So here we're talking about a disciplinary review committee. So when we talk about a disciplinary review committee, what we're talking about is how we sanction or how we decide whether or not to sanction a member or a charter holder if there is some potential breach of the ethical material that we're going to talk about over the next couple of hours. So the CFA Institute Board of Governors has responsibility for this. They're the ones that are going to conduct a professional conduct review, and it's going to be done under the code and standards. There is, of course, going to be a designated officer. That means that CFAI designates an officer that's going to be responsible for this, and they're going to be the one that will actually be in charge of conducting the inquiry once the potential violation has come to light. Now, the question then becomes, all right, if we have the auspices, that is the CFAI Board of Governors, we have the material, that's the code and standards, we have a designated officer, how do they find out that something has gone wrong? Okay, well, or something that's potentially gone wrong? Well, there's several ways that can come about. Of course, we can have something on self-disclosure. So if you write a letter to CFAI and you say, hey, I've been stealing candy from babies, then that self-disclosure, that will be forwarded to the designated officer. The designated officer will decide whether or not this merits a review board, and if there is, then we will go in and they'll gather information and they will conduct the review. Okay, so they can also receive written complaints. So this is written complaints about a member from a client or an employer or anyone else that would be in the investment community. So if you have a client that thinks you've been lying, cheating, stealing, they know that you are a CFA charter holder, they write a letter to CFAI. Well, again, that is something that could precipitate a review committee. Okay, some sort of evidence of misconduct. This could be something that was reported in the newspaper, would be probably the best example. So if whatever you're doing is big enough and is noteworthy enough to end up in the newspaper, then that would be evidence of misconduct. Then CFAI can respond to that. And there's no official statistics on this, or at least none that I've ever seen, but I would bet that a significant portion of the review committees come from this last one, and that is a report from a CFA proctor, CFA exam proctor. Now, just parenthetically, one of the rules of being a CFA exam taker is that you don't mess with the proctors. When they say go, you go, and when they say stop, you stop, and you don't violate exam rules and all that sort of stuff, because they are not kidding when they tell you that you can't have these certain things at your desk and those types of things. So that's just a friendly reminder to make sure you're in compliance with the rules, because CFAI and the CFAI trained proctors are very serious about exam security and exam rules and those types of things. But nonetheless, if something goes awry in the testing room, the CFAI proctor or the CFA exam proctor will write up a little report. That'll be submitted. That, of course, goes to the designated officer, and that's going to lead to a committee. And the word on the street, and again, there's no official statistics here, but the word on the street is if there's a report that comes in from the exam proctor, well, there's just almost no way around that. If you had a passing score on the exam, those scores are going to be rescinded. So just remember, there's having some little note card or some one additional formula written down somewhere where it's not supposed to be is not going to be something that's enough to tip the scales. So make sure that you are in compliance with all of the rules and regs associated with the exam, because the last thing you want to do is spend 300 hours preparing for this exam, be ready, be there, get a passing score, and have that rescinded because of some trivial little thing that wouldn't have made a difference anyway, and that you probably weren't even thinking about. It's probably something you did without thinking, oh, I'm cheating on this exam. So anyway, keep that in mind. All right, so what about the conduct program? What can we do? Well, the officer, the designated officer, at the end of the review can decide to do several things. Okay, one, they can decide that no disciplinary sanction is appropriate. So someone wrote a letter because they were mad at you because their portfolio went down in value by 40%, but they gathered evidence. They saw that the portfolio was well diversified. It was managed in accordance with the governing documents of the portfolio, and they're just upset that they lost a lot of money. Well, in that case, you haven't done anything wrong. Maybe you weren't very good, but in terms of being a great financial manager, but that's not an ethical problem, right? That's a more fundamental problem. But nonetheless, there can be no sanctions that would be appropriate out of these committees. Okay, they could just issue a cautionary letter and tell you, well, this is something that we find alarming, but there's no further action. And then they can also decide to discipline the member, and that means that you can receive a letter of condemnation by your peers, or I think the likely outcome is, of course, suspension of the candidate's participation in the CFA program. So if you work for 3 years, you study 1,000 hours, you get your CFA charter, and then something happens, well, you can have that suspended because of something that you did that you shouldn't have done. So anyway, and I think these are rare events, but nonetheless, it's something that you want to be careful about in terms of the exam. You need to know what's going on, but also remember, more than just the exam, when you signed up to take the CFA exams and when you join CFAI, you take on yourself the responsibility to live up to the code and standards that we're about to review now. I personally am a big fan of the ethics material as presented here. And the reason for that is someone in our industry needed to promulgate that. Of course, finance and economics, or finance and investments might be a better way to put that, is just rife with ethical dilemmas. So we needed some sort of governing document, something to specify what was appropriate and what was inappropriate. And I think that CFAI has done an excellent job of that. And that brings us to the first part of this, which is the Code of Ethics, which is basically a 6-plank platform about what constitutes ethical behavior. We'll go through that, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, which is the standards of professional conduct. Now, this is done under this discussion that we're going to have today is under I think it's the 10th edition, but the one that came out in 2010. So we have the 2010 ethics material, not the 2010, the book that came out in 2010, ethics material, as opposed to the books that were existing before that. So this is the most up-to-date material is what I'm trying to tell you. Now, you know you're getting old and you've been associated with the program a long time when you're in your 4th volume of the ethics material. So I think I've now lived through 4 volumes of the ethics material. The good thing there is that as we see, updates to the code and standards, what was unethical before is still unethical today. So these are refinements to adjust for changes in the markets, and we've seen, of course, dramatic change in finance over the last 15 years. So there's some updates here and there, but basically this is just updating and refining, sometimes some recategorization to make things a little easier to understand. But what is, in my sense, is that over my time, my exposure now through 4 editions of the ethics book is that, they have been very consistent, and I think that speaks well for the fundamental aspects of the code and standards that have been promulgated here. All right, so let's dive in and look at the Code of Ethics. So remember, the Code of Ethics is divided into 6 different parts. So let's look at each one of those quickly, and then we can move on into the heart of the material, the code and standards. So the Code of Ethics Part 1, okay, we're supposed to act with integrity, competence, diligence, respect, and in an ethical manner when we're dealing with the public, clients, prospects, employers, employees, colleagues, basically everyone that we would come in contact with. So this first part essentially says that we're supposed to act in an ethical manner, which is, of course, the most broad statement of what would be considered ethical. Okay, so what's ethical? It's ethical to act in an ethical manner. Again, the very broadest statement that we can have. Part 2 says that the integrity of the investment profession and client's interest comes above personal interest. Now, this last part here that I'm underlining, above personal interest, is going to be a theme that we see repeated several times as we go through the material today. So what essentially you've done by taking on yourself an obligation to live up to the code and standards as you see them here is you have taken on the obligation to subjugate your own interest to the interest of the profession, and in particular the interest of the client. Right? The client's interest is always going to come first. We're also going to see in just a moment that we're going to have to worry about the integrity of the capital markets also. So the profession, the capital markets, the employer's interest, and of course the client's interest are all going to come before your personal interest. So integrity is paramount, and client's interest always come first. There is never ever a violation of that. The client's interest always comes first, no matter what else we say, what else we're talking about. If there would be ever a conflict, so that we'd have something working over here and the client's interest over here, the client's interest always come first. Okay, part 3. Reasonable care and independent professional judgment when conducting analysis, making recommendations, investment actions, all those types of things in any of our professional activities. So this is simply to say that we have to take reasonable care and have independent professional judgment when we are acting in our professional capacities. We're going to see that this reasonable care and independent professional judgment is 2 of the 3 things that I think the standards of professional conduct are built around, and I'll talk to you about those in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so that's 3. What about 4? We're supposed to practice and encourage others to practice, which I've always found to be a very high standard and one that I'm proud to be associated with. But we need to be able to practice and encourage those around us to practice in a professional and ethical manner, and that is in a way that's going to reflect credit on ourselves, on our institution, and on our profession. Now, one thing I'm going to say as we go through this is that CFAI is certainly the watchdog of the reputation of the CFA designation. I think they are also they also play a key role. You might say it's self-appointed, but I think they are filling a gap that needed to be filled in protecting the reputation of the industry. So they are interested in protecting the reputation of the industry and the designation, and so you're going to see lots of references to the integrity of the profession. So basically, be a credit to the investment profession is what this part 4 says. Okay, part 5 says promote the integrity and uphold the rules governing the capital markets. And we're going to see another section on this that's going to give us considerably more detail in terms of what that means to uphold the rules of the capital markets. But basically, when we are talking about ethical behaviors and ethical standards, we can't do anything that is going to undermine the integrity of the markets. You can think of this as the flow of information, the pricing function, price discovery, those types of things. And then finally, and this is also something that I think speaks well of the material here, and that is that we are to maintain and improve our professional competence. So for the next couple of years, as you're going through the CFA program, you're going to be improving your professional conduct, your professional competence. So like I said, nobody gets a CFA charter without learning something. So you're going to be improving your competence as you go through, okay? But we are, even after we leave here, we are to continue to improve. So I think this sets a very high standard and a very good standard for the discipline. Okay, and again, it says not just for us, but to strive to have other investment professionals do the same thing. So we're supposed to be competent. We're supposed to help those around us to be competent also. So that is the code of ethics. Now, would there be anyone who would disagree with the statement that if everyone in our industry lived up to this code, that we would have a better industry? Well, I think that we can look at this and say, yeah, I agree with all that. There'd be very few detractors from that. So these are very broad statements, and I think there can be very broad agreement on whether or not these are of value. And I think most people would say, yeah, those are reasonable. If we conducted ourselves within the bounds of this code of ethics, we would be better as a profession or as individuals practicing within the profession. Now, is this going to be something that's going to be tested extensively on the exam? Well, yes, in an overarching sense, I think it's going to be tested on the exam, but it's such a broad statement of what is ethical behavior that I don't think this is really where the rubber meets the road. So it's great and it's poetic, but what we see is that where we really run into material that gets to the nitty-gritty of the test questions isn't in the code of ethics so much. Now, certainly you need to know the code of ethics. I'm not saying that. Okay, but the nitty-gritty and the time-consuming part of studying is going to be the standards. That is, the standards of professional conduct, and that is where we are now. So the standards of professional conduct here, what we see is that we have this divided into 7 parts, and you look at that and you think, wow, 7 parts, that doesn't seem so bad. The trouble with that is it's 7 parts, and each of these has parts A, B, C, sometime all the way down to E on it. So there's a bunch of subparts. Each of these you have to go through, and it just takes a while to get through. There's a lot of information there, and there's a lot of subtlety associated with this. All right? Now, I would call the first 7 here to be sort of fundamental. That is, these are standards that we could expect anyone who operates in our profession, whether they are a member of CFAI or a CFA exam participant or a charter holder, anyone practicing in the profession, I think could be held accountable. They haven't obligated themselves specifically under this enumeration of ethics, but I think these are good standards that would be sort of universal. The last one, however, deals with specific standards that you have taken on yourself as a CFA candidate, or as a member of CFAI. Or me as a member of CFAI and a CFAI charter holder, or CFA charter holder. So anyway, these are responsibilities that are specific to the candidate, and that's going to be some stuff there that I think is very testable, in particular at level 1, so you can't ignore it, but it is going to be a little different than some of the others. Now, what are these? We're going to talk first about professionalism, then about the integrity of the capital markets. We mentioned that one already. Duty to clients and employers, then investment analysis, recommendations, and actions, and then finally conflict of interest. Now, I think, and I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here, all of this, so please understand that I'm not saying that some of these aren't important. However, I think that some of these might be more important in terms of generating testable concepts than some of the others. And I think that because it is the centerpiece of why we have or why we insist on ethical behavior, okay, this number 3, duty to clients, is probably the most important of the 7 standards. So you'll see that it's one of the longer ones as we go through it. Okay, but what we want to do, remember, the client's interests come first. So what we want to do is we want to protect the interest of our clients. That's the main thing that we're doing here. So after that, I would say that this investment analysis, recommendation, and actions is going to be important, okay, or going to be very important. And then, maybe 4 and 6 there are kind of tied in third place, duty to employers, conflict of interest. Now, that's not to say that numbers 1, 2, and 7 aren't important, okay, and that you only need to study number 3, but I do think that you need to give some special attention to number 3 and special attention to number 5. And if I had to call what was the third one, I would probably call it for the conflicts of interest there, just as where you need to spend some study time and those types of things. I also have some tips to give you on this one, the duty to employers, a way to think about that as we get to that part of the curriculum. All right. Now, I know we've been going a while, okay, but up till now, I would consider everything we've done different phases of an introduction. So we started out saying hi, then we talked about the CFA program, then we talked about ethics, then we had the little diversion into talking about professional conduct review, then we spun off into the code of ethics, and now we have introduced the standards of professional conduct, and this is where the video is going to get sort of into the nitty-gritty. So what we need to do now is we need to jump in and we need to go through each of these standards one by one or part by part, because you'll see part 1A and then part 1B and 1C and so forth, and talk about what the standard is. We need to then talk about the guidance for adhering to the standard, and then recommended procedures, because what they're going to want you to do is to be able to look at this and identify when a particular behavior or activity on the part of a player in a question on the exam is in compliance with the code and standards, and when it is not. And if it is not, what would have been the what procedures should have been in place. That is the goal of studying for this material. So in order to do that, you just have to know this stuff. You have to know this stuff really well. Now, you don't have to know that you're violating Part 1C or Part 1A, which is knowledge of the law. So you don't have to have them identified by the numbering system, but you do have to know that that is professionalism and knowledge of the law. So don't worry about the numbering system, worry about the labeling as you go through here. So remember, the point of this is to be able, and if you read through, of course, if you're a first-time test taker, and let's maybe back up for just a second. If you're a first-time test taker, the curriculum is LOS driven. LOS stands for Learning Outcome Statement. And there are several learning outcome statements associated with this with the ethics material here. But, and in many parts in the curriculum. So if we're going to jump into, let's say, quant methods. Well, an LOS says to be able to calculate some sort of combinations problem. Right? And if you don't know what that is, that's all right. We'll talk about it when we get to the quant methods. Well, you can look at the learning outcome statement and you can take clues from that as to exactly what you're supposed to know. So it helps refine the curriculum and refine your responsibilities as a test taker. If you look at the learning outcome statements in the ethics material, what it basically says is know this material, be able to apply it, and be able to identify violations. And it's the identifying violations that I believe is the sort of the key attribute that you're looking for as you approach the exam with respect to the ethics material. So we need to be able to go through, read a question, and say, okay, is this in compliance or is it not in compliance? And again, it's not going to be something, well, this person's lying, cheating, stealing. Is that ethical? We all know that lying, cheating, and stealing are not ethical. Okay? It's going to be something that has to do with soft dollar standards or reporting requirements or disclosure requirements or something along those lines that we have to be able to identify. All right? Okay, well, that's we can't put it off any longer, so let's jump in and let's look at Standard 1 and professionalism, okay, and talk first about what the standard says itself. So the standard is this, okay, and that's knowledge of the law. That is, we're supposed to understand and comply with all laws, okay, all laws, rules, regulations. Regulations include the code and standards of any government, regulatory agency, or association governing your professional activities. Okay, so what this basically says is we have to know what it is that we're supposed to be doing, and then we have to comply with it. So two things there. Know the law, know the regulations, whether those are governmental or in very specifically, the code and standards. So what are the laws of the jurisdiction in which you're working? What are the code and standards? Know those and comply with them. Now, what about when there's conflicts between the two? Well, there's a very simple rule, and that is to comply with the more strict law. Okay, so let's suppose, we're going to talk a little while about material, non-public information, insider trading. So what if you're working in a jurisdiction that doesn't prohibit insider trading or allows it under some circumstances? Okay, well, if you are meeting those circumstances in the particular country that you're working in, okay, can you trade on that information? Well, what we're going to see in a little while is that under the code and standards, if you have inside information, that's going to invoke a complete prohibition on insider trading. So in this case, the code would be the more strict standard. Okay, so the law says, yeah, you can trade on that under these circumstances. The code says, no, you can't. Okay, well, the more strict standard is going to be the law. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, you have to comply with the more strict law, rule, regulation, whatever it is. Also, you can't knowingly assist in any violations, and if there are violations going on, you're going to have to dissociate. That means you're going to have to separate yourself from this, whatever it is that's going on, and that can involve some fairly drastic action, as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Okay, so what does this mean for us? So as we go through this, what we're going to see under each standard, each part under each standard, we'll talk about what the standard is, then some guidance, and then we're going to talk about recommended procedures. So we'll be able to get sort of a view of what's going on. It's important to realize that listening to me talk about this will help you build some intuition about this ethics material, but you're still going to have to dive in and read some of those little mini case studies and those types of things in order to be able to do well on this. So you can't ignore your Schweizer notes on the ethics material. Lots of people say, well, I'm going to listen to the videos and then I'm going to dig into derivatives. Okay, well, you're going to have to dig in here just like you're going to have to dig in everywhere else, all right? So what about guidance for knowledge of the law? Well, remember, we just talked about the idea that we're interested in the most strict, whatever is most strict. So there can be multiple jurisdictions working, right? You can be living in the UK, you can have a client in Italy, you can be a member of CFAI, you know, there can be overlapping jurisdictions. Your responsibility is to know all of them, comply with the most strict. Okay, if you observe some sort of violation, okay, well then you are responsible to notify your supervisor or the compliance officer, that sort of thing. You may, notice the emphasis on may, confront the wrongdoer. Okay, now that's not actually required, okay, but you may want to, under some circumstances, confront the wrongdoer. Okay, you have to dissociate. Okay, so now what if you're working in a small firm? This small firm is doing something that is pervasively unethical. You've approached the client, the compliance officer, they're not doing anything about it. Well, the point here is that in the extreme, okay, if you are working in this firm where there is this systemic ethical breach, then you may have to quit your job. So what does that mean? Well, that's going to be bad for your family, all those types of things. Well, you can't be unethical just because you've got a family to feed is what it amounts to. So in the extreme, dissociating could mean quitting your job. Okay, remember that inaction can be construed as participation. Okay? And while there is no requirement in the curriculum to report violations to governmental authorities, this may be appropriate in some cases. So, and we're going to have a little more to say about that later on in another section of the exam, or another section of the standards. So that's our guidance for knowledge of the law. What about recommended procedures? Well, not a whole lot more here, but a couple of things to think about. Okay, remember that if you're going to comply with the law, then you've got to know what the law is. So you've got to keep informed. That means you're regularly going to review the written compliance procedures, maintain files, diaries, something showing that you've been keeping up to date in order to protect yourself would be a good idea. Okay, you're going to seek the advice of the compliance officer or legal counsel if you need it. So if there's something you don't understand, then you go and you get some help understanding it, is basically what this says. And while if you're a junior analyst, this may seem like a big deal, but you're supposed to encourage firms to adopt a code of ethics. So I think most firms operating in developed economies anyway today have an officially established code of ethics. But if you work in a firm that doesn't, then you should be in the business of encouraging people to adopt this, to not necessarily adopt this code of ethics, but to adopt a code of ethics. And many firms have just adopted CFAI's code of ethics as their code of ethics. And of course, CFAI loves it when they do that, right? Okay, so what about some more recommended procedures here. Okay, so distribute information internally on applicable laws and regulations. So we're going to have some sort of program to distribute this information. This is going to overlap with the responsibilities of supervisors that we're going to see in a little while, so keep that in the back of your mind. We should have written procedures for reporting suspected violations, and where members are strongly encouraged to report violations by other members. So if you're a charter holder, you have a charter holder that works in your office, you know that they are doing something that is unethical, you have approached them about it, they have persisted, well, at some point you're encouraged to report the ethical breaches of other members. Why? Because we are trying to create an environment where we have self-regulation. So obviously in the United States anyway, we've seen in recent times that while we've been trying to promote self-regulation, we have now come upon a new era of government regulation relatively recently, right? So there's going to be, so because of failures of self-regulation, we now have more additional government regulation, which is not a good thing. It's always better to regulate yourself. That's what I tell my kids. If you govern yourself, then I don't have to govern you, and that's almost always going to be better. All right? Okay, so let's move on now and talk about Part B. So this is Standard 1B, so we're still under professionalism. Here talking about independence and objectivity. And this actually speaks directly to one of what I think is the three pillars associated with ethical behavior. Okay, so the three pillars of ethical behavior, and then the fourth caveat is going to be disclosure, but the pillars are: one, act independently and with objectivity; two, have a reasonable basis, that is, be diligent and have a reasonable basis for what you do; and third, consider suitability. All right, man, so it's not enough just to know what the security is. You have to consider whether or not it fits into your client's portfolio would be an example of that. So independence, you've got your head on straight as to who you're working for. Diligence and reliability, we'll talk about that directly in a little while, and I'll bring these three pillars up again when we do it. Okay, and then suitability says consider the client's needs, not just the security itself. And then if there's any problems with any of that, then we have to disclose. So disclosure is kind of the fourth element there in my three pillars, if you want to think of it that way. So independence and objectivity, this is a great big thing. We're going to see it stated basically in a couple of ways as we go through, using slightly different words, but nonetheless, this is a huge deal. So what does this say? We're going to use reasonable care and judgment to achieve and maintain independence in our professional activities. So what does that mean? Well, what that's saying is that we're not going to have our decision making tainted by other constraints. So we are working for someone. Okay, that could be the employer, that could be our client, or however we're defining it in a particular question or scenario. Okay, well, we have to make sure that we understand where our loyalty lies, and then we have to live up to that debt of loyalty is basically what the independence objectivity thing is. So we don't want to offer, solicit, or accept any compensation that could compromise our independence and objectivity, and we're going to see some examples of this as we go through. But you can think of this in association with gifts, which is the first part here under guidance. So what about, and here, this is the first time it's come up, but this is a great way to think of ethics questions. And there's a lot of ethics questions that I view under this particular scenario. Regardless of what it says in the question, this is the way I think of it. Okay, so with whatever's going on, think of it in terms of a money manager dealing with a relatively unsophisticated client. So you have a money manager dealing with a relatively unsophisticated client. Okay, well, under those circumstances, what is it that they should be doing? All right, and there's lots of ways to describe the relationships around a particular concept on the exam. But if I'm confused when I read a question or I'm not sure what the answer is, I take that concept and I apply it, or I take that scenario and I apply it in that way. That is the money manager, the unsophisticated client, and I say, now is this appropriate? And there may be some deviation from that, but that's a good way to sort of reboot your thinking if you feel like the question is muddled. So what about gifts? So if I'm a money manager working with an unsophisticated client, hey, I'm supposed to be working for the client. I have a fiduciary responsibility to that client. Okay, well, what if I'm taking bribes, i.e. big gifts, from a broker? Well, the broker is trying to do what? They're trying to get me to direct brokerage business to them. Okay, am I then operating in the best interest of my client? Well, that's what we're getting at when we talk about independence and objectivity. Now, there is the idea that we're hoping that people within the investment industry have enough integrity that modest gifts aren't going to make us completely hose our clients or completely, breach the trust that we have with our clients. In an older edition of the book, and I don't know if it's survived to this edition, I don't remember, they used a de minimis rule of, if something was worth less than $100, then, that was no big deal. But the point here is modest gifts are not considered a violation or would not create something that would have to be disclosed because they're tainting your independence and objectivity. So if somebody gives you a fountain pen that says, Charlie's Broker on it, well, we're hoping that's not going to ruin everybody's integrity. Okay? But if it is not a modest gift, okay, if it's a weekend at the condo in Vail or something like that, then that's going to be a problem. Now, here's a very important aspect of this idea of independence and objectivity, and that is to distinguish between gifts from clients and gifts from entities that are trying to influence a member's behavior. So, for instance, okay, if we have a client that comes to us and say, look, if you can beat the market by 50 basis points in the next quarter, you can use the condo in Vail for a weekend. Okay, well, that's one thing. That's a gift from a client. On the other hand, if the broker came in and said, look, if you will direct brokerage to me, or without even saying it, say, would you like to use my condo and Vail for the weekend? Well, they're the ones that are trying to influence our behavior. That is who we're directing trades to. So there's a difference between gifts from clients, okay, that is gifts that flow along the fiduciary lines, and gifts from other parties that would be trying to influence our decision making. Gifts from clients aren't specifically excluded here, all right? So you can accept a gift from a client provided you disclose it to the employer. We're going to have more to say about that later, okay? And you have to get permission for if the gift is associated with some sort of future performance. So again, if they say, oh, you beat the market by 50 basis points, you can use the condo and Vail, and you go to your employer and say, hey, they've made me this offer. Is it okay if I would accept this? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Your employer probably won't let you. But if the employer says it's okay and it's a gift from a client, well, that's going to be okay also. Okay, some more guidance along these lines. Members are responsible for hiring outside managers. Shouldn't accept travel, gifts, or other entertainment that can impair their objectivity. So if you are, putting together a team of managers for a client, well, you can't have the clients flying you around to all these expensive hotels, that type of thing. Okay, I think a key thing, this showed up on several of my exams as I recall. Now that's been so long ago that I don't really remember it. But anyway, investment banking relationships. So you've got, you can think of this, and a good way to think of the information flows within the firm are to think of yourself or whoever the player is in the question as being in the research department. And then you also have, the M&A, and you have the investment banking and all those other type things. Well, if you have the investment banking offices are trying to generate some investment banking business, and they come to you and say, look, we're trying to underwrite a big new stock or bond issue for this company, but we need a positive recommendation on their stock. So, make sure and write a good report. Well, that would be bowing to pressure from some other department who is trying to go out and generate business, and that is clearly a breach of our independence. So if we're going to issue a research report, it's got to be because we think that this is, a buy, or we think it's a sell, or whatever it happens to be, but we can't be influenced by other areas of the curriculum. Okay, what about issuer paid research? Well, the idea here is that a flat fee is going to be preferred, and of course that's going to need to be disclosed. All right, where are we at? Okay, so I think we still have some more guidance stuff here. Okay, members working for credit rating firms should avoid influence by the issuing firms. Of course, if you're rating a company, you're going to issue a bond rating, or you're reviewing their bond rating. Well, you don't want to be influenced by the firm that you are rating, right? Well, that would be tainting your independence. Okay, users of credit ratings should be aware of this potential conflict. Of course, this has been something that has come to light in recent years because of problems with the financial crisis that started in 2000. I guess it was 2008, right? Anyway, so best practices for analysts to pay for their own commercial travel to firms being analyzed, or to firm events and those types of things. So rather than having someone else pay for your travel, if you're paying for it or your firm is paying for it, then you don't have to worry about having your independence tainted because someone else is whining and dining you. Okay, so what about recommended procedures still here on 1B? Okay, well, remember, the whole point of this is that we are supposed to protect the integrity of our opinions. When we issue an opinion or take an action, that is supposed to be something that we did because it was in the best interest of those that we're serving. Okay, so it has to be an unbiased opinion. That's the whole point here. Okay, how do we do this? Well, we can create a restricted list, that is, securities that we can trade on or securities we can talk about. Okay, special cost arrangements, of course, should be limited or restricted. Okay, we want to limit gifts, maybe prohibit gifts altogether. Okay, we want to have some clear guidelines set by the firm. Okay, something we'll see again in a couple of other places is IPO shares. So think of this, when you see the IPO stuff in the ethics material, think of it as a hot IPO. It's oversubscribed. Everybody wants shares in this thing, right? Because of the normal IPO underpricing. Okay, well, if you have that scenario going on, okay, how are you going to allocate those shares? Well, we'll talk a little more about that as we go through some of the other standards. But basically what we're going to say is, one, you can't be doing it in a self-serving way. And two, you have to, of course, follow your fiduciary responsibilities. So be careful with the IPO thing. That's going to come up in several settings. Next, misrepresentation. I think this probably speaks for itself, but remember, misrepresentation is a fancy word for lying. Okay, so we don't want to do any lying here. We don't want to misrepresent what it is that we can do in terms of our investment analysis, recommendations, actions, all those types of things. So we're supposed to be honest. Well, that would seem to be one of the true pillars of ethical behavior, would be to be honest, right? So the standard covers all communication. So you can think of, some people would think of this as written, but this would also be oral communication. And throughout the ethics material, what we see is that electronic communication, which I actually think of as code for email, okay, maybe it's broader than that, but it specifically mentions email in a lot of the little case studies and vignettes that you see in the book. So if you're sending an email, that's still communication. If you're writing a note, that's communication. If you're talking on the phone, that's communication. You can't be lying about it. Okay, what shouldn't you lie about? You shouldn't lie about the qualifications of the firm, okay, and the services that it can perform. You also shouldn't lie about your own qualifications. So it's one thing to say, you know, I take some graduate classes at the University of Chicago. It's something else to say I'm an MBA student at the University of Chicago, right? So if you're just taking classes, well, you're not an MBA student, so you have to be very careful about that. Okay, of course, we can't guarantee a certain return. So, we've earned 12% in the past, we're going to earn 12% per year. Well, that, of course, is covered under government regulation in many countries, but nonetheless, you can't promise rates of return, and no plagiarism. So we have to, and that's anywhere, written, oral, or electronic communication. We can't plagiarize what's going on. We can't plagiarize other people's work, and we will see that there is a caveat there that's going to be important here on the next slide. Okay, so what about recommended procedures? Well, we need to make sure that the firms are assisting the employees by providing a written list of the firm's available services. So what is it the firm can do? Well, if we have clearly enumerated what the firm can do, then we can help our employees avoid misrepresenting the firm's qualifications of the firm's services. Okay, we need to maintain records, and again, we're going to see that this is a standard in its own right later on, but we have to maintain records of the research materials that we've used, and we have to give them proper quotation. So you can use other people's work, but just like in English class when you were in high school or college, well, maybe not English class, depending on where you are, but just in a language class when you're writing a research paper, you have to go back and make sure that you give credit when you're using someone else's work. Now, there is an important caveat there, and that is an exception, and that is if we are using recognized financial and statistical reporting services. So if you want to say the stock price went from $3 to $4.87 during 2000, and you fill in the year. So if you want to do that and you got that information from Bloomberg, you don't have to say per Bloomberg, because Bloomberg is a recognized financial and statistical reporting service. It's something along those lines. Then that does not have to be reported. All right. Some more on recommended procedures here. Okay, so what about models and analyses that others have done? Okay, well, you can use those, but you have to make sure that you have attribution. Okay, we'll also see later that we're responsible for those models or those analyses, because we have to make sure and go back and check the rigor that underlies that. We should encourage the firm to establish procedures for verifying marketing claims of third parties that are recommended to clients. So if we are recommending a third party's services to one of our clients, then we have to make sure that we are investigating their marketing claims. At least that would be a recommended procedure. All right? And that brings us to part 1D, which is misconduct. Now, this is what I actually call the mommy rule. Okay, so the mommy rule basically says that you shouldn't do anything that would make your mommy upset with you, all right? So you're not to engage in any professional conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or commit any act that reflects adversely on the professional reputation or integrity or competence. Okay, well, if your mother would look at that and say, oh, you shouldn't have done that, Johnny, well, then you shouldn't have done it, all right? That's the misconduct rule. So if you're lying, cheating, stealing, those types of things, if you're trying to deceive, then you are going to be violating this misconduct or the mommy rule. Guidance here, remember that the standard covers conduct that may not be illegal, okay, but could still adversely affect the members' ability to perform their duties, their reputation, that sort of thing. So the idea here is that the Code of Ethics poses a higher standard than what the law would simply purport. Okay. Okay, what about recommended procedures? Well, we need to adopt a code of ethics to which all the employees must adhere. If we don't have a code of ethics, it's hard to hold people accountable to an ethical standard. We need to disseminate a list of potential violations. So those things that we know about that are common, okay, we ought to make sure that those are watched and that they're known, and these are something you're not supposed to do. And we ought to have the associated disciplinary sanctions published also. We ought to do some other simple things like conduct background checks when we're hiring people and things along those lines. So make sure and use hire good people, give them ethical standards, and then hold them to those standards is basically what that says. All right? Well, good news. Okay? We started out with 7 parts to the code, to the standards of professional conduct, and we are now through with the first one. So we're done with the standard number 1. We can move on to standard number 2 here, which deals with the integrity of the capital markets. So which would be nice would be to have a really clever joke to tell here, although ethics just doesn't lend itself very well to jokes. So we'll just have to dive back in and try to do a little bit more of this. So looking at this in terms of standard 2, the integrity of the capital markets. Well, what is it that we are responsible for here? The first thing, standard 2A, is material, non-public information. Okay, now there's 2 things that you have to remember here. One is that it's non-public, that is not available to everyone, and 2, it's material. And we're going to talk about non-material, non-public information. But here we're talking about material, non-public information. So this is information that the members are in possession of that could affect the investment's value. That would be one thing. Information that would affect the investment's value or something that the typical investor would want to know. Well, if you have that, you must not act or cause someone else to act on that information. So the mere possession of material non-public information essentially invokes a ban on any action regarding that information, regardless of where it came from and all that sort of thing. All right? Okay, in terms of guidance, material, what does that mean? If disclosure of the information would affect the security's price, well, that's one attribute. Okay, and beyond that, even if we're not sure it would affect the security's price, if the reasonable investor would want to know it before making an investment decision, it's still material. So that, I think, is a very high standard or a broad standard for what would constitute materiality. So even if you're not sure this would impact price, but yeah, this is something I would at least want to know before I made an investment decision, then it is material. Now, they do have this caveat that if the price effect is ambiguous, well, I don't know if this is going to be a good or a bad thing, then it may not be material information. Okay, this also extends to information such as upcoming rating changes, influential analysts' reports that are going to be released and those types of things. And this, when we see this is where it extends, okay, this is probably one of the centerpieces of what we're trying to get at here in terms of material, non-public information. Hey, some more guidance here. So information is non-public until it's been made available to the entire marketplace. So the point here is that if we're making information available to analysts, so you got a CEO, he's talking to a room with 40 analysts, and he says, well, next week we're going to announce that our earnings are up, exceeded expectations by 6 cents. Okay, well, or whatever it is, by some increment. Well, what does that mean? Is that now public? Well, no, that was made available to analysts, but it's not been made available to the general public. So we can't act on that until they actually make the announcement, and all investors would have access to that. So remember that act would include trading on the information or in the security, but also in related derivatives, swaps, options, those types of things. So we've got to be careful. We cannot act on that material in any way. Okay, what about what would we do if we have the material? Sorry, got one step ahead of myself there. So if you possess material non-public information, you simply have to act like you didn't know what that information was. So if you violate that standard, you act differently than if you had not known the information, then you are violating this. Now, there's an important idea here called the mosaic theory that you need to spend a little bit of time, make sure that you're on top of. The mosaic theory basically says this, okay, what if we have public information and we have non-material, non-public information? So we got all the public stuff, all the stuff you get off Bloomberg, out of the New York Times, what if anywhere in the financial press, those types of things. Okay, so we've got all the public information, and then we have non-material, non-public information, and we can weave those things together to come up with superior analysis. Okay, so in other words, the story I always tell with this is that you're an analyst watching a particular industry, so you know the industry well, you've got all their 10Ks and you've got all the reports and you know what the firms do and what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then you're sitting in a restaurant for lunch and you see the CEOs of those two firms eating lunch together. Okay, and that is the non-material, non-public information. So you see the two CEOs together, and then you start thinking, those firms actually have complementary market space attributes, complementary resources, those types of things. They would make good merger partners. So you start thinking, well, what if those two firms were to combine, and you end up coming up with some superior analysis, you trade on it, and you make lots of money? Is that okay? It is okay. Okay, so we're not trying to preclude superior analysis here. If you have non-material, non-public information, you combine that with public information, you weave that into a superior mosaic, okay, well then you are more than welcome to trade on that, is basically what we're getting at here. What about some recommended procedures? Hey, well, we ought to have an information barrier or firewall. So if you work in the industry, in most developed countries now, you're very familiar with this, but we have taken, it seems like the pendulum's actually swung a long way to me, but nonetheless, we take a lot of pain to make sure that information doesn't cross from investment banking into research or whatever you have there. We limit interdepartmental communication. This would also, apply to restricted list securities, and we're going to review employee trades to make sure that we don't have an employee that just happens to be trading just ahead of all opinion changes that are released by the firm or something along those lines. Okay, so what about finishing up this recommended procedures here for Part A? So increase the review or restrict proprietary trading when the firm's in possession of material non-public information. Well, of course, if we have material non-public information, then we have a heightened standard that we need to be able to apply in order to be able to comply with the ethics material here. And that brings us to Part B, which is market manipulation. So market manipulation simply says, okay, that we can't engage in practices that distort the price or artificially inflate trading volume with the intent to mislead market participants. Now, so this is, the intent to mislead has to be there, okay, but we can't affect price or volume. So both of those are going to be included in this prohibition on market manipulation. And here we can see that under the guidance, hey, do not engage in any transaction-based manipulation. Don't give the false impression of activity. Okay, don't try to gain a dominant position, corner the market, those types of things. And of course, we don't want to be distributing false or misleading information, because not only would that be market manipulation, but that would also be a violation of the misrepresentation standards and a violation of the misconduct standards. So you would see there that you would have lots of problems associated with doing that with respect to manipulating the markets.